they need to be able to do really well without a but. And I think they're aware of that. And I've been arguing for that. One of the things that means is a higher level of capex, and that will flow down to the people who are listening on this broadcast, right? The most important piece of a railroad. Railroads have a couple of big advantages in transportation. They're very labor efficient, right? You know, you think of a double stack train versus the trucks. They are very fuel efficient, 4 to 1, the AAR says. And think about what that means also in emissions. But those two or three items are being attacked by people in Silicon Valley and Austin, Texas, and whatnot, who are developing electric vehicles, who are developing autonomous vehicles. They're not necessarily looking at the rails in their sites. Maybe it's just a side effect. But the big advantages rails have in those arenas are, if not going to be eliminated, are being chipped away at.
You may know the American Railway Engineering and Maintenance of Way Association, or AREMA, as the, quote, keepers of the manuals. You may know them as the, quote, people behind the largest annual railroad conference in North America. Heck, you may not know about AREMA at all. This podcast is designed, no pun intended, to change your view of who AREMA is and how AREMA has changed the trajectory of many railway careers over its 100-plus year history. Welcome to Platform Chats with your host, Walt Blesser, where he takes a moment to discuss the impacts AREMA has had on the very people who are proud to be called members. Are you ready to roll with AREMA?
ARE Corporation is a proud supporter of AREMA and Platform Chats. If you are looking to take your railway structures career to the next level, or simply start it down the right track, please visit us at arecorp.com. Please see our brand new job postings on our careers page or on our LinkedIn page.
Hey, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of AREMA's Platform Chats. I'm your host, Walt Blesser. I apologize once again. We've had a bit of a issue with the cadence of our episodes this year. I don't know what's going on, but it seems like every time I go to record, something has happened in my life. This past time, my children gave me a nice little sickness that allowed me to not even be able to talk. So I had to reschedule with today's current guest for a couple weeks. But without further ado, I'm super excited. We've got Tony Hatch. If you've ever been to any AREMA conference for the last, at least since I've been going, which is about 2005 or 6, I've remembered seeing him up on stage, and he gives an excellent animated speech on the market from a New York analyst's perspective, and I always look forward to it year after year after year, and I'm stoked that I get him one-on-one here for a minute on the podcast. And I think if you do know him, many of you, I'd say almost all of you, probably should know him. You know that my talking in this episode is going to be limited because he has a lot to say. And
What are you
so
saying there? I'm a loudmouth?
So without further ado, there it is. Tony, if you could just, give our listeners a brief background, and then we're going to jump right into it.
All right. Well, thank you, and thanks for also. I rescheduled one, so thanks for your patience with me. I've been an analyst covering the railroad and related industries with the Class One, sort of the sun, and others as moons around them of various sizes for about 30 plus years. Um, I went started going. I went into finance, and I went to work for the. I went to Solomon Brothers and went into their second training program. The first training program in Solomon Brothers was written about. Unfortunately for me, the book came out after I'd left the training program, but it was in Liar's Poker, which was Michael Lewis's first book. I highly recommend it. It's hilarious. Obviously, I knew most of the people involved, but I didn't realize how uncool it was until I read the book to be an analyst as opposed to being a hotshot trader. But after going through the training program, I essentially apprenticed as a railroad analyst by chance. Given a choice of a couple of industries, I chose rail because I'd been a history major, and obviously that's important. And because I thought it was really important to know with rail, with the commodity base, you had to be conversant on a wide variety of topics. You weren't going to be bogged down, if you will, in a single commodity that might go up or down and be depressing. But you had to know about autos and grain and manufacturing and it, at the time, I didn't think much of intermodal, but soon the consumer as well. I did that on the street for over a decade. I was ranked in the way we rank it, called the Institutional Investor All Star Team. I had left one big bank where I worked under a former ICC commissioner, Jim Whitco, as the lead rail analyst at PennWeber, to go to NatWest to help privatize the European freight rail system, which never happened. One of the two great lies, I believe. One is we're fully committed to the capital markets, and the other is that we're going to privatize the European freight rail system. Neither turned out to be true. It was a great experience, but they closed at the turn of the century, and I decided rather than go back into Wall Street, and do some other kind of job or go on the buy side or the investor side, that I really had gotten the industry bug. I had developed a extensive Rolodex. I talked to somebody last night who literally did not know what I meant when I said I have a big Rolodex. But in other words, I had a lot of contacts, or they had no idea of the reference. Even though I don't use one anymore, it's still very visible in my mind. I really like the industry. So at the turn of the century, I started my own practice, ABH Consulting. It's my initials, not very imaginative name, but it was a great time to start. Railroads were down and out. People who followed the industry as an analyst for what analysts do is they help follow the industry for professional investors who care about the earnings projections and the finances and the strategy, et cetera, of the industry. All those people wanted to move to San Francisco and follow software companies because we weren't going to move any goods. It was going to be moving electrons only. So while that proved to be both a big thing out there, it also was untrue. From that point on, the railroads have crushed the stock market. The rail renaissance, as I called it, happened right on my independent watch. I mean, it's purely coincidental. I'd like to say I have, take credit for it. Also, the rise of independent needs for research, hedge funds, activist funds, which is it's a kind of a dirty word, private equity infrastructure funds who are obsessed with short lines, lots of different stuff happening. So I was able to create this business. One of the things, so I do three things. I follow publicly traded companies, much as the analyst for Bank of America does. I follow private companies like the short line industry and other suppliers. I follow railcar leasing companies, and I don't follow them the same way. They don't publish the same kind of data, but I try to stay cognizant, and that's the second leg, sort of private companies or due diligence on deals, or bespoke, as we call it, research, something a project on the Panama Canal, let's say, and what does East Coast versus West Coast intermodal mean for the industry. The third leg of my three-legged stool is public speaking, and that's where you've seen me. Because I don't have to go to Cleveland twice a year and spend 3 days talking to investors there, and I'm not on Cleveland, lovely town. I just been, the sell side analyst at a bank has obligations that as an independent I do not have, and that frees me to go to try to as many of the stakeholder conferences, ARIMA being a major one, Railway Interchange in the fall. But I just came from NARS, North American Association of Rail Shippers, who gave me in 2019 their Person of the Year award, probably my highest honor. And as I like to say, 2020 we had a pandemic, so I'm the only 2-year holder of that belt there. But I go and speak at all these conferences, and then I run my own conference called Rail Trends with my allies and partners at Progressive Railroading Magazine. So by getting out to ARIMA, I meet people, I learn about capital spending plans, I learn about new ways to do with maintenance, all sorts of things that that same as when I go to shipper conferences, I learn about whether railroads' efforts to get better service are actually making it way down into the field to the people that matter. I've addressed labor. When I go and give my speech, and I'm not going to do the hard one here, but later ARIMA will have a Zoom of my speech, and you've seen me do it live. That's sort of my entry ticket to get there and then go to the coffee break and the bar after dinner and talk to people and figure out what's going on in the industry in ways that simply listening to company presentations won't do. So that's what I do. I've been doing it now for 20 years. It's sort of a self-perpetuating machine, if you will. I love the industry. It's gone through some significant hard times of late. All at a relative basis, they're all earning a fair amount of money. But certainly from a public and governmental and shipper and employee relations perspective, the rail industry has gone through some tough times. So I look forward to Renaissance 2 at some point, and I can talk to you later on about why I think that might actually happen.
Awesome. Well, yeah, I appreciate you taking the time to be with us. I understand that, yeah, you technically are not an ARIMA member, but you are as far as I'm concerned, you're an associate member as far as...
I'm an ally.
I just can't... You're an ally. There you go. Yeah, I just can't imagine a conference without seeing you up there. And so I guess you and I spoke earlier, and we just had a couple of different ideas of some of the things we should cover today. And I think the big one right now that's in a lot of people's mind, and I mean, for the first time in my rail career, so I've been around for about 20 years, I had neighbors and friends asking me about the derailments in Ohio and
Yeah.
Norfolk Southern and safety. And it got the attention of the general public that honestly, Tony, just most people don't really care what I do. But for some reason, when this happened, they had want to get my take on it. So I'm going to flip that over to you.
So my mother actually called me in the fall and asked why railroad workers don't get paid sick leave. Right? She'd never concerned herself whatsoever with what I did in the railroad. Not to pick on my mom, but when the railroads had taken 3 body blows in the last roughly 18 months, and each of these has progressively moved railroads from the business pages to the front pages, and not in a positive way. Not only because you don't want to be in the front pages for negative things, but also because the people who then write in the front pages don't know the industry. The first was the supply chain crisis, crew shortages. This was a universal problem. It was true at fast food, but specifically in supply chain, it was true at warehouses. There were shortages of chassis. It was true at the shippers themselves, at drayage truckers at the ports with ships lined up, 100 deep. But railroads have their own regulatory bodies. So they had hearings on the Hill in which the chairman, a good friend with whom I disagree about a lot, said, basically called the railroads out for being inept. Then came the labor contract, um, which came to a head in the fall. And it's important, and I've really tried to stress this to the front page writers and to my mother and others, that this was a regularly scheduled round of negotiations, delayed by the pandemic for a year, but taking more or less the usual amount of time. And like several times in my past, going all the way to a presidential emergency board and then the Congress. That's what the Railway Labor Act allows it to do. And because labor this time had basically all the face cards, it paid off for them to delay this as long as possible. And because they knew that Congress was going to be the ultimate arbiter of their paycheck, in effect, they they used social media, a new phenomenon, right, out there to help talk about their conditions in order to condition the public, like my mother, who were going to condition Congress. Once the PEB report was out, I knew there'd be no strike, but it really made the railroads seem overly greedy, right? They make all this money, they buy back all this stock. Why aren't they giving their workers more? Why don't they have paid sick leave? It's important to note that during the 3.5 years of negotiations up to the fourth quarter of last year, labor had never asked for that. But that being said, they won this round hands down. All the things that the investment community might have looked for out of the labor contract when it all began in 2019, very little of it came to pass. And then we had, going to your question, East Palestine in early February. Railroads are inept, they're greedy, and now they're unsafe. Um, you could argue about how ept they are, if that's a phrase, and we could have an argument about that. They're no more greedy than anybody else, including labor and other industries, and they're clearly not safe. But this was the really big blow that got people to talk to you, about this, et cetera. And I really want to say, it's deeply unfortunate. It was highly unfortunate, and I'll get to this in a second, that it happened in Norfolk Southern for the reasons of the great experiment. We'll talk about that, but also because they have in the past tried to get out from the common carrier obligation. It's important to note that railroads are not allowed to carry these goods; they are compelled to, and the government, which compelled them to, even when Norfolk Southern tried to get out from these obligations, the government should have stepped up and said, "You know what? We're in this together. Railroads are safer, so we make them do this." Sometimes things happen. It appears that in this case, when we wait on the final NTSB report, it appears that the railroads did all the right thing, and accidents happen. I mean, they're very rare on railroads. That's why we do it. They didn't say any of that, right? Both parties, are. I mean, my faith in government already been lowered by the last 8 years, but was crushed by the hearings when I heard the right say that railroads don't care about towns like East Palestine, despite the fact that Norfolk Southern had 13 employees from there, and that most of their employees looked like the people of East Palestine, and the left saying, of which I'm more, as a New Yorker, you can guess where I likely vote, right? But they're saying profits over people, buy back stocks, ignoring the fact that the rail system, thanks to the good people in ARIMA and others, it's a B plus on the American Society of Civil Engineers report card. B for the industry, B plus for freight, compared to a D on the highways, right? So ignoring that railroads are spending money, for safety, that hot box detectors were voluntary, let's get down to what's actually after a really awful period of time. Um, I think things in a PR front have somewhat stabilized, and they're. I don't think the railroads are unsafe, and I don't. Nobody was injured, much less killed. I think they'll be able to, at great expense, mitigate future issues. The inventing of the car on national TV was a bad issue, but not an NS decision. They participated in, and they have pledged to do what's right. And I know Alan Shaw. I believe that they're going to. And I just saw him at NARS in Chicago, and it was a very moving speech with a video that it's a major issue for the industry. So the industry, as Joe Henricks, the new CEO of CSX, said, the industry is now hated by all of its stakeholders except one, and that would be my group, the investment community. That's probably too strong. He was making a point. But let's get to directly with the safety issue and the acts in Congress. Everybody's coming out of the woodwork trying to get their own pound of flesh. There's even an effort to make larger truck size and weights, having nothing to do with this, to legislate two-man crews. There were three on the locomotive that had nothing to do with the accident. They cut themselves loose from the train and moved a mile away. So you could have had 12 people in that locomotive. There may be ECP brakes, probably not. And maybe to have more hot box detectors. Remember, those were voluntary, not got. The railroads put them in as a sign to me that they don't like to run off the tracks. It's expensive. It is the antithesis of reliable, consistent service. And that they're citizens. So the railroads have taken a blow. The biggest thing I'm worried about, and we can move on, is overreaction, and we're seeing that in the public statements, but also the the missed opportunity. The railroads have technology that's important to ARIMA people that we've seen work on the Canadian National, that like automatic track inspection. And when they installed automatic track inspection at CN in areas, they found a 90% increase in finding things. To be shows you my technological skill. The same thing goes with car inspection portals, where you can run through at speed. The FRA has fought this very heavily for basically as a jobs protection thing. Obviously, you could use fewer people if machines work. But the real thing here is the capacity you save. If you're running cars through at 50 miles an hour and they're being better inspected than by the tired, cold human eye, you're also not taking hours out of freight revenue time. If you're inspecting the track with a car that looks like a box car, and we saw it at CN's Investor Day, I've seen it before, but in Chicago a couple weeks ago, you're not taking up a 5 mile an hour, high rail in the very expensive mainline. So these things are one of the first things that happened after the accident and all the reactions is several of the railroads, having signed their national labor contracts, had talked individually to their individual conductors union and whatnot, and had worked out pilot programs to do a conductor on the ground, which would have one man in the cab. And remember, the government is subsidizing autonomous trucking, research. But also that person who has a territory rather than riding the train has a schedule which allows him or her to go and see their children play sports. And one of the big issues is quality of life. So it really had the potential, if it worked out right, to be a win-win. All those have been abandoned for the present. Everybody has stepped back in this sort of safety witch hunt environment. And so what we're missing here is lost opportunity.
Interesting. And I'm going to there's a lot to unpack there, obviously, but we talked briefly about some of the leadership changes. I know in the past, 2 or 3 years, we've seen BNSF, their CEO changed in 21 to Katie Farmer. CN had a change in CEO in 22, and Alan Shaw took over NS in May of 22. So about a year ago. Does that sound right to you?
Yeah, I think he's about a year in now.
Which seems like that would be a tough time to step into that role. Yeah.
You also have Union Pacific, and I know we'll talk about that, about to change. KCS, the CEO, resigned as part of the merger. So I mentioned already, every railroad out there has gone through a leadership change. One of the things where your audience and I might differ is I'm very pleased that so far, and I'm talking about more resume than specific people, that they have gone the route of hiring a marketing-based person. Now, Alan Shaw has operational and marketing skills, but he was a CMO. 80, all of them have some operational background, but they were coming from marketing. And I think railroads these days need to be more customer centric, more stakeholder friendly, and that's a big issue that we'll talk about, the so-called great experiment. but we have seen a leadership change almost across the board. I'm trying to think if anybody, when we get Union Pacific, we'll have completed the deck. So yeah, we are. Alan did step in. He's a lifelong NS employee, but at the top job, right, things were going really swimmingly for him. In December, he had an investor conference that really was, here's my team, my new COO, Paul Duncan, and here's the guys, and this is the team, and here's what we're gonna do. And he really, in a kind of back to the future, but also a radically different change, started what I call the great experiment, which is we are not going to focus. PSR has taken us this far, but it often leads to an over focus on the operating ratio. And if you are incented financially and otherwise on the operating ratio, the easiest way to change that is cost cutting. We're going to invest through a cycle. We are our experience with furloughing in this awful pandemic. We have to really keep remembering how traumatic that really was. But historically, these are rough numbers. Railroads would furlough people when in a known downturn, right? When you like the Great Recession of 08, 09, right? So they could flex their costs down more than people gave them credit for. But when they wanted the people to come back, the vast majority came back, right? They took the time off to see their kids and go hunting, and then they all came back to work. This time, 30% or so did. And so there were labor shortages everywhere. And they realized the cost of hire, of reaching out to hire, training and installing and getting experience for these crews, plus all the lost business, both normal business, i.e., losing share and things like paper, but also lost opportunity in intermodal and others, is way too big a cost to bear to try to, manage short-term costs. Nobody in any industry really predicts, can predict short-term economic conditions. It's the longer term we can talk about e-commerce is going to grow, but nobody's been able to really say what's going to happen next quarter, right, or next year. And so running too fine a PSR system, too fine a just-in-time system, that works when the sun is out, and the sun is often not out, right? Weather, economy, pandemic. And I think the railroads have all learned from that to build a resilient case. The economists are calling it just in case as opposed to just in time, which is really having a resilient supply chain, multiple options. This really started going back to Fukushima in Japan when the auto industry was shut down because all of certain kinds of paint came from there, right? And they couldn't finish certain kinds of production. And nobody ever thought we can't have paint all from one place on an island, you know. So that's one of the big issues. And Joe and Alan Shaw really spoke to a change in mindset. The investors represent the whole lot of opinions, right? They are very short term. They're day traders to people who hold stock for a decade, right? You'll hear more the loudest of those who are going to talk about operating ratio and short term changes. And so he had to fight back and say the ROI, the return on investment, is going to be better if we win the trust of our stakeholders. We don't have to keep hiring, and attrition will decline. Shippers will give us more business. The entire 20th century doesn't look like it from this date, but it's been a really good one, the rail renaissance. But the railroads have always taken two steps forward and a step back. They're doing really well, but then growth overwhelms their capacity, right? Or they're doing really well, and there's some other, the pandemic happens, or a flood or a hurricane. They need to be able to do really well without a but. And I think they're aware of that. And I've been arguing for that. One of the things that means is a higher level of capex, and that will flow down to the people who are listening on this broadcast, right? The most important piece of a railroad. Railroads have a couple of big advantages in transportation. They're very labor efficient, right? You think of a double stack train versus the trucks. They are very fuel efficient, 4-to-1, the AAR says. And think about what that means also in emissions. But those two or three items are being attacked by people in Silicon Valley and Austin, Texas, and whatnot, who are developing electric vehicles, who are developing autonomous vehicles. They're not necessarily looking at the rails in their sites. Maybe it's just a side effect. But the big advantages rails have in those arenas are, if not going to be eliminated, are being chipped away at. The other two big advantages railroads really have are the network with that high grade rating from the engineers, the fact that network pays taxes, right? Which means it's politically palatable versus, look, how long did it take to get an infrastructure bill passed? We get one every decade, it seems, right? So also, if they see something like the need to build a huge new intermodal terminal like Barstow or Big, Barstow Intermodal Gateway that BNSF is doing for $1.5 billion in California, they can just do it. Right? They have to have a good return. They have to make a good case to their CFO and to the board of directors and to their shareholders. The shareholders in BNSF's case being just Warren Buffett. But they have to make a case for it. But they don't have to wait for a political compromise to do it. That's a real advantage. And then the last advantage railroads have is that they have a lot of money. They've done well. They generate a lot of cash. They can reward shareholders in a balanced plan, and I believe in buybacks and dividends. Otherwise, the stocks go down, and then people try to come in and raid them, and they don't spend on capital. What they've been spending, the network capital spending, has been very steady through all the PSR and economic ups and downs of the last decade. So they are able to fund if they need more technology. It's just a matter of will, right? In previous crises, the railroads had when they were deregulated, they were 40% of the track miles were Chapter 11. I mean, this a whole different world. So it's just up to them to spend it wisely and have good leadership. And I'm greatly encouraged by this new generation of leadership that we have that you alluded to.
Yeah, because it looks like, and to pile onto that, Mr. Fritz is stepping down as well, correct?
Yes. Union Pacific tried to say this was a regular part of business. Lance isn't very old, and he's certainly very healthy, but he's been there a long time, and I was wondering what they were going to do, and they said, they've been looking for a while, and they put out a press release and Winter Sunday, and I thought, hey, people don't put press releases out on Sunday. One of their investors, not a large percentage, but $1.7 billion worth of stock, had basically been complaining. So we still have activists, out there. They really want a COO, Jim Venna, late of UP, also of CN. I don't think they're going to get him. He's been vetted several times. He's still actively campaigning for it. I have nothing against the man personally. I told you before, it's the resume job. They've also said they're going to look, for a world-class person in the industry or adjacent industries. I think that's really boxed them in a corner. One of the problems that UP has had of late is they keep boxing themselves in a corner. They keep referring to their G55 or 55 OR target long after OR targets were really a fashionable thing politically and even now in the financial community to talk about. They kept saying they were going to spend 15% of their revenues or less on CapEx, which was an unnecessary line in the sand, bailed out only because fuel surcharges inflated revenue. And here they said they need a world-class person. Now, in the rail industry, I would argue there's only one world-class person, and that's Keith Creel. I'm not saying there aren't other people who could be, who I don't know that are, but think of the Union Pacific job as like the manager of the Yankees, right? It's the prestige organization in the industry. When they say they're going to bring in a world-class person, they mean somebody they can introduce as world-class, as opposed to will develop and really be, they've had great success with Jack Koraleski and Jim Young, who became world class there. But they really boxed themselves in and said, so what I think, and based on what Lance said at NARS just last week in Chicago, that they're going to hire from outside of the industry a la CSX, where they brought in Joe Henricks, ex-president of Ford. Joe has been a smashing success so far. He's all about culture change, and he speaks the truth. I really think he's done a great job. He's only 8 months in himself, so he's still feeling his oats. We don't know what his final team will be because he didn't come with a team. He came from another industry. In fact, Joe is, as far as I know, the highest ranking incoming person. I mean, Union Pacific and CSX both in the past have brought in outside people into significant roles. Think of Oscar Munoz at CFO at CSX, for example, and often with a path to the top, but never at the top to start. That's a really unusual thing. I think Joe is going to do it, is doing a tremendous job for the industry as well as for himself. And he's part of this great experiment of, really looking to improve relations with labor, to become a growth machine as opposed to just a cost cutting machine. So that's all good. I have a feeling that that's what Union Pacific will now try to do as well. I have no idea who that person will be. I don't think they are in an operational problem at Union Pacific. In fact, relative to BNSF, they seem to be really performing quite well. But what they've done a couple things. They've drawn those lines in the sand. They've quite unnecessarily picked fights with the STB. I think they could have avoided some of them. And really, they haven't lived up to their potential. That's the biggest thing. They have the greatest franchise in the rail industry. That's a phrase I was told when I started back in the Salomon Brothers training program. I don't think that's been eroded. In fact, their Mexico position, is even bigger than we ever thought it could be, et cetera, et cetera. So whoever comes in Union Pacific is that stepping in some big shoes, and it'll be the front page of the Daily News and the New York Post. I mean, it won't really, but I'm making the Yankee manager, statement. It's a big job. Frankly, my first thought is that Keith Creel would. I mean, he's not, but it is the big job. Keith is making a heck of a. Keith is running. Please, all you guys, forgive me, but he's turning like the Tampa Rays into a perennial contender. He did at CP, and that's what he's doing in this combination. They're still the smallest, even in combination railroad out there. The Yankees are like, the Union Pacific is like the Yankees, and so under a lot of circumstances, you would say anybody would take the Yankees job. He's not going to go. He has so much on his plate and so much opportunity. But the UP situation is like the biggest question mark after the legislative impact. My sources tell me that the railroads can head off truck size and weight and head off legislative bad decisions based on the accident. But until they do, that's that's probably job one, and then job two is who's at Union Pacific.
So, and you've been around this industry a long time, and as you started out at the very beginning talking about how you've been analyzing the class ones for years, and I'm just sitting here looking and listening to you talk about the leadership changes, and there were 7 class ones until not too long ago. Now there's 6, and you listed literally 5 of them have changed CEOs in the last 2.5 years. Is that normal, or is that pressure to once one does it, the rest of them have to follow suit? I don't know how to ask the question.
Pressurized. CN had a really unusual circumstance. I mentioned Joe coming in, and first time, maybe since the turn of the last century, when bankers were often CEOs, right? J.P. Morgan would install someone when Wall Street ran railroads. Literally, they were headquartered in New York. When I started my career, Union Pacific was on Park Avenue, right, where I'm talking to you from. So back then that happened. Non-railroads, they'd come in to represent their financial interests. Since then, these people have come out of railroading, and then Joe comes along. An investor, the Children's Investment Fund, forced a change at CN. Now, let me backtrack about TCI, as it's known in the business. TCI made a successful proxy attack on CSX in 2007, where they had 5 of their 6, if I'm remembering correctly, proxy board members elected to the board. CSX later called it a victory because those people had to leave because the Great Recession meant that the Children's Investment Fund, all the stocks went down. They had to sell CSX to pay redemptions. They came out of nowhere. That was the first proxy fight since I think 1954 New York Central, before my time, even before my time. One interesting subset of that is they were a client. I wasn't advising them on proxy fights, but on railroads and how they would do. And my contact was Rishi Sunak, who is the Prime Minister of Great Britain. So, I have friends in high places now because of that. But TCI comes back around and is the largest shareholder of CP, passive, not activist. After all, what could you do with Keith? Who are you going to bring in to replace Keith? God. When Keith spoke at Rail Trends, I said, I'm really sorry I didn't build a little pool for you in front of the podium because we all wanted to see if you truly could walk on water. He got the joke because I wasn't being serious. For those of you religious minded, I do not mean to offend. But TCI also was the second largest shareholder of CN. So they played an outsized role when those two carriers were bidding and fighting for Kansas City Southern in a battle that we now can look back on that said should never have happened, because once the old rules and new rules issue with the STB was resolved, that was game over. But it played out months longer. But it's really interesting to have a single investor of both companies playing, puppet master. Very reminds me of Jay Gould and whatnot. Well, they did make a run at a proxy fight on CN and forced JJ Rouet to retire. And one of the things they were talking about, which I regret, one of the things they were talking about was, or they allowed analysts to say this on their behalf without correcting them, this is going to be a return to margin from growth focus. We do not want to see that, right? Margin should come, as Keith Creel says, the operating ratio is the outcome of a good process. If your process is working, that'll be fine. So JJ left, that was forced. You could argue that Lance was forced by, I don't know what's happened in the boardroom there, but one large shareholder, only 1.2%, but almost $2 billion worth of shares. Um, the You came in and basically put this letter out, and that's happened. So the rest of them were natural heredity, by which heredity is term longevity. Jim Foote was 67. Carl Ice was, it was weird that it all happened so quickly, but most of it, well, actually, if we're talking about five, three of the five came as a natural process, right? Um, and we were given good signaling. Even BNSF, which doesn't care about analysts, clearly signaled that Katie Farmer was the chosen person, and as should be, and so that all was normal. Foote was a surprise only because we didn't know when he was going to go. Jim was my oldest friend in the business. I met him when he was investor relations for the Chicago and Northwestern. Some of you in the podcast Google that. That was an old railroad, part of the Union Pacific. Um, so, so Jim, I was sorry to see Jim go, but he'd already tried to retire before. I think he wanted to see CSX stabilized, after the pandemic and the hiring issues, and he did get to see that, and then was ready for the next phase. So it's a really interesting time because there's big changes, including maybe at this point we're going to have two of the six, 1/3 could well be outsiders, right? If Union Pacific does what I suspect but don't know, but suspect they will.
Interesting. And maybe that is an excellent transition to one of the final talking points we wanted to cover on this podcast, which was the CPKC merger. I mean, I'd love to hear you talk about that a minute.
So the railroads, I told you, the three big body blows, and as Joe Henricks of CSX said, the stakeholders don't like us. We've, all this anger, these dumb things that are being piled on in Congress are really a product of these guys hearing from their constituents for a long time all the problems with, the over focus on short term and whatnot. Some of that is misunderstood. I don't believe it was as bad as they say, but the point is, chickens are coming home to roost. How do you change that situation? The public eye is important. Congress has a role, right? What do? Well, you change the mindset. You do the great experiment led by the East. I would say that CN, they said their investor day, I could put them in the guys of like looking longer term. CN refused to talk about operating ratio. All the railroads have changed their compensation plans to look at safety, service, and return on investment, which links my stakeholder group, the financial community, with the employees, with the customers, and with the regulators, and et cetera. That's the first thing. That's going to take time. You have to build and earn trust. The other thing is really to focus on growth. Part of the great experiment is investing in growth, right? Not cutting back, providing reliable service. People will want more of it. It is cheaper. It is a better emission story. People like to brag about that. That's not yet a direct selling point. It's an indirect one, but it's moving up the food chain. The best example, the fastest example to show growth will be CPKC. They're having their investor day. I'm not sure when this will be broadcast, but we're talking at the beginning of June. At the end of this month, you're going to see a big investor day in Kansas City where they lay out all their plans. This merger is unlike any of the others I've followed in my career because it's unlike most mergers in the past were 80% cost cutting, 20% growth opportunities. And we never know if they got that growth. I mean, if companies got big, they got blended in, and how could you tell what would have happened? This is 80% synergy or 80% revenue enhancement, 20% cost cutting. After all, they only meet at one place, Kansas City. There is reductions in, management, most luckily by retirement, as the KCS management was getting closer to those ages. But this is a growth-focused merger. They're going to talk about growth, linking Mexico to Canada, linking the auto cycle all the way, linking oil sands to Texas and into Mexico with refined products, linking Midwestern grain down in corn is the biggest U.S. export to Mexico, threatened a bit by Brazil. Topic for another day. But if they hit their targets, and I think their targets are very ambitious, they're going to hit them. Whether they could do it in the time frame, I'm a little more skeptical. Nobody's really done any hard diligence on this, and I'm joking a little bit here because, as I said, Keith walks on water, and the belief sort of is he's always hit his targets. He's actually always outperformed his targets. So I'm just going to assume 1.5% of his 150% of what he says. But all that said, this story will change the dynamic of how we think about railroads. The Great Experiment is the biggest story, but that's going to take time. This one, they're going to start growing next year. They're going to be putting more track in next year, or later this year, and that's a good one to change the narrative. So it's really good if you're a shareholder of that company or a shipper on that company, but it's also good, if you're Norfolk Southern or Union Pacific. Union Pacific is fighting; it's going to lose some market share, so they might not think that all the time in Omaha. But to change the narrative, um, like KCS and CP have always been really the favorites at the STB of the class ones. They didn't follow CP only had a really tiny piece in the U.S. But if they do this, they do it safely. They have they don't get customer complaints. We can start turning the page from these three blows we hit and look to a better and brighter future. I'm really looking forward to the month. Also, the Royals are in town.
And do you think that they will? Do you think that will lead potentially to a second renaissance?
Yes, I think it has to, or we're all in trouble. There's a little bit of faith in there, but there always is with this. I think there's significant market share that has been lost that will flow back with a little bit of reliability. That's sort of normal share. And I still think the opportunity, for example, in domestic intermodal, um, Katie Farmer said that as when discussing her big project, Barstow Intermodal Gateway, said that in the LA to Chicago lanes, there could be 6 to 7 million loads that are available to rail, of which they're the largest player, that they think they're achievable. That's the same size as their market now. And that's in the most mature, the most, that lane has always been a big lane for BNSF, and for UP. So yeah, I think there's the opportunities out there. I thought it for a while. I've seen strong hints for a period of time that they can do it. I think the rail systems now have created both a north-south opportunity as well as a traditional east-west um, growth opportunities in Halifax, and in the ports. One of the things we didn't talk about is I think we're about to see a share shift from the east back to the west to LA Long Beach. That's very positive for railroads. Even eastern railroads would rather get business out of Chicago because all that business will be on their train versus the business they would pick up at let's say Charleston. Most of it's going to be trucked because it's close by. Um, so I have hopes for that. So I think there is the opportunity that I saw a decade ago has not been achieved. They've done it for 2 years and they fall back for whatever reason. Sometimes calamity not of their doing. Um, if they could show consistency, I believe it's there that they could grow faster than the economy, thereby gain share. I think if they do, we're all in a better world. Not just Tony, not just Arima, but North American citizens.
Absolutely. I think we're going to wrap this up. I just want to say, I think one of the coolest things about hosting this podcast is getting to talk to people that are extremely passionate about what they do, and you obviously fall into that category. And I think we got a lot of listeners out there, even trying to define what they want to do with their careers. And I think just talking to an analyst of the industry that many of us participate in intimately. Do you have advice for young people that are looking at the railroad industry as a potential place to start a career?
Well, I think you have to be prepared for bumps. It's an outdoor sport, as they all like to say. But I believe in the future. I believe we could have a second. The first Renaissance of 1400, 1500, but that was before we had Da Vinci. So there's room for more Renaissance, and I think it's going to be an interesting industry. I think they are increasingly committed to diversity, opportunity for young. I think they're changing the way they deal with young people. I think the old command and control military attitude that kept them alive and thriving from the Civil War till now. But we're in a new era, and I think the new leadership is cognizant of that. So I think it's a pretty good time to be a young person in this industry. And like me when I was struggling, fumbling around in the turn of this century, only to find the industry sort of grew up around me and became really interesting to people. And luckily, I knew something about it. I think they'll find that right now this low point is the floor, and we're going to move up from here.
There's no better way to end this podcast. So thank you so much for being here, Tony.
Absolutely.
And I look forward to seeing you at the next major rail event.
Absolutely.
Thank you for rolling with ARIMA on today's episode of Platform Chats. For further information about ARIMA, please visit arema.org or contact us at info@arima.org.